Okay, thanks for coming to another one of our speaker series, everybody. It is my pleasure to introduce Eliza McCullough. She is the Program and Research Lead for Fairness, Transparency, and Accountability at Partnership on AI.
I want to see somebody
Oh,
send me the picture of the mom.
I'll just mute you then, Ramteen. Eliza is committed to developing research at the intersection of artificial intelligence, racial and economic equity, and policy that powers community change. Without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce Eliza, and the floor is yours. Please go ahead.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me join one of your sessions. I'm hoping this presentation will be mutually beneficial as I'm about to enter a process for gathering a lot of feedback on a resource I've been collecting, and I'm eager to get feedback from all of you. So yeah, it's great to meet you. Today we'll be talking about the Participatory and Inclusive Demographic Data Guidelines, which we're about to publish for public comment this next month. So my plan for today was just to do some welcome and introductions. I wasn't sure how many folks would join, so I had planned to go around and have everyone say something briefly, but it might take too much time, so maybe I'll have everyone put it in the chat. I'll then go over demographic data and algorithmic fairness at Partnership on AI, like our work stream, and our research. And then I'll go into the actual resource that I'd like to talk about today, the demographic data guidelines. I'll give an overview of sort of the guiding principles for that work and our content. And then I'll go over our next steps, where we'll have sort of a call to action for all of you to submit a public comment next month, and then end with some Q&A. So instead of having everyone go around and say this, I would love to maybe get this in the chat. We could I'll spend a minute just going through it. It would help me get a sense of who's in the room, name, affiliation, and what interests you about AI ethics and accountability. I'm not sure where you are in your programs, and yeah, it'd be great to hear folks' background. So I'll give everyone a second or so to add that to the chat. And I'm sure you all know each other too, so I'm sorry that this is a repeat for many of you, but it would be helpful for me. Cool. Great, and while people are adding that, I'm reading through a bit. As Calvin said, I'm Eliza McCullough. I lead our research on algorithmic fairness, transparency, and accountability at Partnership on AI. My background is in labor and technology, but I've increasingly moved into algorithmic discrimination space. And a lot of my current research focuses on data governance, particularly of identity or demographic data. And I'm excited to be with all of you today. Okay. Yeah, so go ahead, feel free to keep adding in the chat, and I'm going to move us on to our next slide. So I wanted to start with a bit of background on Partnership on AI for those of you who aren't familiar with us. We're a nonprofit organization that facilitates a partner community of academics, civil society, tech industry, and media organizations. So we work to address the most pressing questions concerning the future of AI. And our work contributes to the development of resources, recommendations, policy briefs, and best practices for AI. We split our work across 5 programs. Those include my work in the algorithmic fairness space, to AI and media integrity, to safety critical AI, labor and economy. We envision a future where artificial intelligence empowers humanity by contributing to a more just, equitable, and prosperous world. And this multi-stakeholder partnership is the basis for how we do our work. So we believe that any meaningful progress on building a more equitable tech ecosystem will require collaboration from all sectors. And the tech industry alone cannot address problems posed by AI, and neither can academia, civil society, media, or the public sector. So we need all of us at the table to achieve meaningful change and make sure no one gets left behind. So as I mentioned, I lead the Fairness, Transparency, and Accountability team at PAI. So first of all, why does algorithmic fairness matter? Although I'm sure many of you in this room have thought quite a bit about algorithmic fairness. So algorithmic systems are used to determine outcomes in a growing number of settings, from housing to hiring decisions to healthcare treatment recommendations. Any discrimination propagated by these systems can reproduce and magnify existing inequities in our world. So if we agree that achieving algorithmic fairness matters, how do we detect unfairness or bias? Bias detection can occur through a variety of methods, from qualitative interviews and focus groups to statistical analyses of user outcomes. So because these statistical analyses are currently the most popular in the field, our team focuses the majority of our work there on like how those processes happen and how can we make them better. And these statistical analyses require the collection of, most often require the collection of demographic or identity data, like race, ethnicity, gender, sexuality, etc., from those who are interacting with the algorithmic system. So say, for example, a company builds an algorithmic system for screening resumes, but they're worried that the system is discriminating against women applicants. They would likely need to collect the demographic information, like their race, ethnicity, gender, from those interacting with this algorithmic system to see how outcomes are distributed across identity groups. But while this collection of demographic data is necessary to assess bias, it's also quite complicated and holds a number of risks for users, particularly socially marginalized groups. This is because people want to be both represented accurately and don't want to be counted. This contradiction is due to a long history of harms associated with both the inclusion and exclusion of marginalized groups in formal demographic data sets. So an example of this paradox, the 2020 US Census, for example, missed 9% of Black residents, higher than any other demographic group. And those missing data points mean missing dollars for the Black community. The US also has a history of weaponizing demographic data sets against marginalized communities. The 1940 US Nationality Act required that non-citizen immigrants register at their local post office and notify the government of any address changes. This same data set was then used to target and incarcerate Japanese Americans during World War II. So all of this historical context and complexity surrounding demographic data collection caused us to consider the following question. What are the risks posed to individuals and communities by demographic data collection for an algorithmic fairness assessment? And we thought about this question from both a technical and a socio-technical perspective, drawing from our multi-stakeholder community. And we conducted about 2 years of research on this question, and we found that while the vast majority of technical literature focuses on the privacy and security risks associated with identity collection, people are actually quite concerned about many things beyond just privacy. And these include possible harm stemming from the miscategorization and misrepresentation of individuals in the data collection process. So your identity being miscategorized or misrepresented. The use of sensitive data beyond what data subjects expect. The expansion of surveillance infrastructure in the name of an algorithmic fairness assessment. The misrepresentation of what it means to hold a certain identity. As well as data subjects ceding the ability to define for themselves what constitutes biased or unfair treatment, as often in these data collection processes, that's decided from the top down. So following all this research, we started to think about what would be required to conduct a demographic data collection process for a fairness assessment that not only prevents these harms, but actually advances the needs of those of us who interact with algorithmic systems. And that's our particular focus was on people from socially marginalized groups. So our intended impact for this project was to provide organizations that develop and or use AI, this could be in the private or public sector, with guidance on how to collect and use demographic data for fairness interventions in a way that advances the needs of data subjects and communities, particularly those most at risk of harm by algorithmic systems. So that was our focused audience, was actually on the groups that are conducting fairness assessments. And usually the groups that are most equipped to do so are in the private sector, but we hope that this will also carry over to other sectors. And our secondary goal was to generate a resource for policymakers, civil society advocates, vendors, and other third-party stakeholders on responsible demographic data collection and use practices. There's a huge gap in terms of policy on this issue, and we're hoping that this will provide the blueprint for policy in the future. So as I just noted, our primary audience was AI developing and or AI using organizations tasked with carrying out a fairness assessment. Our secondary audience was policymakers, civil society, researchers and academics, and public agencies. So just a quick note on our methods of how we came up with these guidelines. We began our drafting process with a literature review of relevant themes, including data governance, data equity, and data justice. We then convened our participatory and inclusive demographic data working group, which is composed of members from the tech industry, academia, civil society, and government offices. That includes groups like the McCullough Center for Applied Ethics, the Data Economy Policy Hub in South Africa, Apple, Google DeepMind, and the Center for Democracy and Technology. And these groups, people from these organizations were based in the US, the UK, Canada, South Africa, the Netherlands, and Australia. Our working group met monthly from January 2023 to March 2024 to discuss and co-draft each component of the guidelines. We also gathered feedback from attendees at workshops hosted at Mozilla Festival, the Data Justice Conference in Cardiff, Partnership on AI's Partner Forum, the Columbia School of Social Work, the National Fair Housing Conference, and the National Fair Housing Conference Racial Equity Group here in the US. As well as PAI's demographic data quarterly community meetings. And because we're a US-based organization and the conferences where we presented the guidelines all took place in the global north, we decided to commission seven equity experts residing in the majority world who specialize in data justice to review the guidelines. We also commissioned a disability rights expert, a racial justice expert, a data justice expert, among others, to provide in-depth review, given the relevance of the guidelines to their expertise. So I'll now give a brief overview of the guidelines' content and structure, so you have a sense of what they're about. And as I'll explain, we'll publish our draft for public comment on May 14th. At which point we'd love to get your feedback from all of you on the details of the actual guidelines. It's a pretty long document, so apologies that this probably will not capture much of it, but just to give you a sense. So central to this resource is the concept of data justice. And the way we define data justice is defined many different ways, but we define it as the idea that people have the right to choose if, when, how, under what conditions, and to what ends they are represented digitally. So we outline 4 key principles that practitioners should uphold at every stage of a demographic data collection and analysis process when they're going to conduct an algorithmic fairness assessment. The first of these is to promote the right to self-identification. So this means that organizations should make every effort to provide data subjects with agency over how their identities are represented when collecting a demographic data set for fairness assessment. And that might sound, I don't know, depending on your vantage point, a bit like basic, but I guess the most common technique used in fairness assessments is actually assigning demographic traits, whether that's like assessing for skin tone or gender, things like that, based off of photos or text, things like that. So it's actually quite rare to have a self-identified data set. And there's many barriers to it. It's much more expensive. It's much more time consuming. It can lead to messier data sets. But all of our research points to the fact that this is actually quite crucial to leading to more just algorithms. People have to have the ability to identify themselves. Our second is co-define fairness. So this is the idea that organizations should work towards aligning how they plan to define fairness with data subjects' expectations of fairness when collecting demographic data for bias assessments. So often, the organization will decide what fairness means for that context on their own without consultation from the people who are interacting with the system. And those two people can have quite differing ideas of fairness. There's like a whole stream of work in academia about just defining fairness itself. And it's really crucial in ensuring that people who interact with the system have a say in what fairness for that system means. The third principle is to practice affirmative, informed, and ongoing consent, which means that organizations should prioritize consent constantly throughout the demographic data lifecycle. That means providing people with opt-out throughout the life cycle, ensuring that people know all the different ways in which their data will be used, and not repurposing a data set without people's prior consent. And then finally, we have promote equity-based analysis. So this means that organizations should focus on the needs and risks of groups most at risk of harm by an algorithmic system throughout the demographic data lifecycle, and really holding the needs of that community, and therefore also like the voices of that community at the center of the design process. So beyond these 4 guiding principles, we break down exactly what organizations should be doing at each stage of the demographic data lifecycle for a fairness assessment. So I'll show you a bit of our structure. So we organized the whole resource is meant to be quite actionable. So we decided to organize our recommendations by the demographic data lifecycle, which I'll show you in a moment. Because that's how a team conducting a fairness assessment would move through the process. So we're trying to make it as like applicable to their work as possible. So at each life cycle phase, we included a description of what that demographic data life cycle stage entails. We then outlined key risks faced by data subjects and communities, particularly marginalized groups, during that life cycle phase, and practices that organizations should aim to follow to prevent these risks. So these include baseline practices. These are the minimum practices that organizations should follow to mitigate risks against data subjects and communities. And we have recommended practices. And these are the practices that organizations should follow to best advance the needs. So not just preventing risks, but actually advance the needs of data subjects and communities. And then finally, we list guiding questions that organizations and practitioners aiming to proactively measure and mitigate algorithmic biases should reflect on during that life cycle phase to ensure that they're achieving the recommended practices. So here's an example of the demographic data life cycle. We developed this through iterative drafts with our working group last year. And note that this is not demographic data for like advertising or for other uses. This is demographic data used towards a fairness assessment. So it's pretty specific use case of identity data. And we start with planning and design, move to consent, collection, and you'll see it's all these arrows, although there are a few different recursive arrows. So at the analysis phase, a team might realize that they need to move back to planning and design and redesign the data collection process, or they might realize that they need to move back to consent and ask for a different use of the data. So they expect to do one type of analysis, but need to change course. They have to move back to consent and get new consent for that. Similarly, at implementation and share back, so when the bias findings are shared, they might need to go back to planning and design to redo the process, or similarly move back to consent. And also notice that over this entire data life cycle is documentation and data governance. So that applies at every single life cycle stage. So here's an example of some of the content included in the guidelines. So this is for the planning and design phase, which is the first demographic data lifecycle phase. And note that the things here listed here aren't comprehensive, but they're just meant to give you an idea of the content. So a risk to data subjects and communities during the planning and design phase might include impacted communities potentially harmed by the algorithmic system are excluded from the planning and design phase and don't get to inform the demographic data categories that the team plans to collect. A baseline practice that teams could do to mitigate this harm is the team indirectly integrates perspectives of impacted communities during the planning and design. So that could be through a literature review, or perhaps they have third-party conduits like academics or civil society advocates. And then our recommended practice is that impacted communities potentially harmed by the algorithmic system are directly involved in designing the fairness assessment process, including identifying relevant demographic data. So perhaps that's through focus groups or interviews or a working group, something like that. And here's an example of some of the guiding questions that we outlined for teams during the planning and design phase. And remember that these are questions that organizations and practitioners aiming to proactively measure and mitigate algorithmic biases should reflect on to mitigate risks faced by data subjects and achieve the recommended practices outlined for that phase. So these include: how will we define a successful outcome for the fairness assessment? What steps can we take to align this definition with that of other relevant parties, namely data subjects and communities most at risk of harm? What demographic attributes do we anticipate will be salient for this fairness assessment? And how do we get feedback on this assumption from relevant community members and/or experts? What socio-technical expertise might be relevant to our fairness assessment, i.e., racial, gender, and other social equity experts? And how can we ensure this expertise is incorporated at appropriate times? So as I noted, we wanted to make these guidelines as actionable as possible. So we also created an accompanying worksheet for organizations to use alongside the guidelines and track their progress. Like the guidelines, this worksheet is organized by the demographic data lifecycle. So at each phase, we include the actors, internal and external to organization, that might be relevant to the implementation of the guidelines at that phase. We also include a sample of impact indicators for teams to track their progress on implementation. And at the top of the worksheet, we include a compatibility checklist for organizations to go through to make sure that their intended project is a good fit for the guidelines. So here's an example of what the implementation worksheet looks like for the planning and design phase. So here we list the relevant actors internal to the organization who might be involved in this phase. So that could be developers, engineers, research scientists, user experience researchers, ethics teams, product managers, legal officers, comms team, and inclusive design teams. And these are relevant actors external to the organization who might be relevant. So this could be academics focused on race, gender, immigration, et cetera, depending on the use case, as well as leaders from community orgs that advocate for or work on behalf of relevant user populations. So like a gender equity advocate or immigrant rights activist. So these are various metrics that teams can sort of use, again, not comprehensive, but to measure their impact. The number and diversity of socio-technical experts involved, quality of contributions proposed by socio-technical experts, and/or number of changes made to the planning and design process based on feedback from those experts, number and diversity of data subjects and/or community groups involved, and number and quality of touch points with data subjects and/or community groups during planning and design phase. So finally, we also will publish a hypothetical case study in which an AI developing and deploying organization conducts a fairness assessment of their algorithmic system following the participatory and inclusive demographic data guidelines. So basically showing like if an organization were to implement these guidelines at every phase, what would that look like? And it's meant to better illustrate the implementation of the guidelines for readers. And again, it's organized by demographic data lifecycle phases. So our next steps for this project, we are publishing for public comment on May 14th. And then through June, it should say July, but in June and July, we'll be gathering targeted feedback. So we'll be leading workshops. There'll be like a mass call through our networks, and then we'll be incorporating that feedback. And then in August, we'll be publishing a final white paper, which will include all the feedback gathered during the public comment process. As I mentioned, it would be amazing to get comment from any of you here today if you're interested in this topic. I think we want these guidelines to be useful in as many settings as possible. And we know that there were many types of perspectives that were not integrated in the drafting process, but are crucial because demographic data collection is important in a range of settings. So if you fall into that category, it would be great to hear from you. Any questions? And I will share the link to sign up for our workshop where we'll release the guidelines and ask for public comment right after this, but wanted to first stop for any questions.
This is really great work, Eliza. I'm sure that folks in our group will have some comments, feedback, or will be interested to participate in the discussion and hopefully be involved in this feedback that you folks are looking to gather. So I'm interested in getting some info on how you said you're doing a mass call through our network, so please include us in that network.
Absolutely.
Yeah, maybe I'll let the group here that might be working with this kind of stuff for their projects take the lead with some of their thoughts.
Great. Yeah, I have this question if this is a useful starting point for discussion. It's also fair if the guidelines are quite a large resource and I tried to give a sense of what they include, but I also understand if you need to just actually see them and read them to be able to answer a question like this. I will share our listserv link where you can sign up, where we'll be announcing the guidelines publicly, and I'll also make sure, Calvin, to add your name to my like targeted outreach list so you can share the call with this group. Yes, so we'll be planning to hold a workshop with the Center for Democracy and Technology in mid-May. Would be great for you. It'll be open to the public. It'd be great if you all could attend. And that will be sort of like a live chance to provide feedback. But there will also be an online form of which you can provide feedback. But for right now, if people have initial thoughts or questions, I would be happy to hear those too.
I'm thinking about a point that was made pretty early on, which was about the need for inclusivity in data sets, but also understanding harms from previous profiling practices. And I'm wondering if you could share some of your thoughts on how to balance those two things.
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think it's like the paradox that's really central to our work where you know, like identity data is collected. You need identity data to often understand and correct algorithmic discrimination. And yet that process for collecting identity data can end up hurting the very same people who are harmed by algorithmic discrimination. So it's sort of like this catch-22. And often the people that you're trying to see or help through that data collection process are also the least likely to participate in that data collection process because they've have historical harms associated with formal data collection, particularly like top-down data collection processes. So what this resource really tries to do is like to promote the agency of those communities. I think when those, as hopefully like those historical examples that I was citing show, like when those processes are quite top down, and don't include consultation from or participation with marginalized communities, they're much less likely to participate, leading to like less inclusive data sets,
Yeah.
and like magnification of harms. So that's what we're calling for here. And I think it's like, as I was saying with promoting the right to self-identification, it's a much more difficult path to take to try to get like self-identified. And it's not always possible for like legal barriers or like organizational constraints, thing like that. But striving towards self-identification, I think is a really necessary goal. And I think it's not valued enough currently in this landscape. Yeah.
Yeah, it seems this approach is an approach to gaining trust. And this self-identification process you mentioned is more expensive and longer, but I guess necessary for that trust to be gained. Okay, I see some hands in the chat. I'll
Yes,
let you
and
pick.
one point on, sorry, Calvin, right before and then I'll go to
No, go ahead.
hands in the was that, I mean, I think this point about trust is really crucial, and this came up repeatedly. Like there is a lack of trust that, you know, a single organization alone can't correct for these like long histories of harm and marginalization. And truthfully, like I don't think even guidelines, even best practices can really, like these guidelines can correct that that history or like that lack of trust. And really it will take like really comprehensive data rights and like data rights policy in my mind to provide people with the kind of protections needed for trust to be built. And like I was creating these in the US in a context where we have zero data privacy rights, like truly nothing, you know, which is why would you trust any company? They could just turn around and do whatever they want with your identity data. And so I think it's a great first step to have these guidelines, but that is the environment we're operating within in many countries. So okay, whose hand? Sananda? I think your name's up first.
Hi, can you hear
Hi.
me?
Yeah.
So yeah, I also work on this histories of data harm, and I was wondering if you can talk about how to build the trust that we have been talking about among communities from whom demographic data is collected. And you talked about self-identification, but are there any other ways you can build the trust? And also, how do you negotiate? Like, are there any guidelines and the principles that you see when you approach companies versus governments who collect demographic data? And also, and maybe start with US because the at the in different countries it's the reality is different, and the needs are different. So how do you have any guidelines for differentiating between companies and governments when they collect data, and in the context of building trust?
That's a great question, and I think points to how there can't be really a standard approach to how to collect identity data, or like there should never be, because it's quite relational and it depends on people's relationship to the entity that is collecting that data. Like to me, it means something quite different to give Meta my racial identity versus the US government, you know, and I think that is true. It's very different country to country too. And people have quite, I mean, race means quite different things, gender means quite different things in different countries. So I think the very first step that these guidelines are trying to take is to say to companies, you cannot just import in these top-down gender, racial, various identity categories and like impose them upon a population and then look for discrimination in that setting, which is currently what is done a lot of the time. Like to be white in the US means something quite different than it does in like even Switzerland or something like that, and I think currently what's done is these transnational companies will take the identity categories that are salient where they're based and impose them on other contexts. So what these guidelines are trying to do is say you need to create relationships with people who interact with your systems via conduits or whatever ways possible, quite early on in that process, so they can inform every step of the way. And it's like, I think in the end, you probably end up with not just a statistical analysis of identity categories, but also hopefully other ways of gathering information about algorithmic discrimination through like fairness groups, user testing. Like there's quite a lot of different pre and post deployment fairness techniques that can be used. But yeah, sorry, that was a bit long-winded, but I hope gave you a sense that there's basically trying to push back against any kind of top-down or like one-size-fits-all model and move towards a relational model that's inclusive from the start, I guess. Yeah.
I know there has been some stories on how WhatsApp says that they did not give governments their data, like the conversation data, but there has been stories that say that they give the metadata to the governments routinely in the US. And do you see any way to address that fact? And yeah.
Yeah. I think this goes to my point that I was saying to Calvin of like, there are limits to the kind of trust that can be built in a context where there are no legal data rights. Like there's real limits to that. And I came up against them in creating this resource. Honestly, like I think this is probably as far as you can go as an individual actor in an ecosystem where people have no reason to like believe a company when they say we're only going to use your data for these reasons, like they could turn around tomorrow and say actually we think we're gonna like, and there's not really anything we can do about it in the US. That's slightly different in like Europe, for example. But so to me the next step for this work has to be policy, I think, because
And also, who is categorizing the data? Because governments are looking for categorize, not the raw data, but they are going to um, refine it, right? Like tag it. So that's how the different usage will be determined.
Yeah, completely. Audie, I think I'm pronouncing that correct.
Yeah, hello.
Hi.
Thank you for sharing your very interesting project. Like I was thinking about your question that how we can make these guidelines more applicable to our work or to any organization work. As a PhD student, I'm working on the institutionalization of AI ethic in organization. And I was looking at your slide on planning and design and all the relevant actor that should be involved at this stage. And I was thinking, yeah, that would be the ideal, like the best we could wish for. But I'm just wondering which organization has all those resources at first. Like how many organizations have a ethic AI team, for example? And how many organizations have time and the resource to bring all those people, an inclusive design team, a legal officer, a PR manager, and so I was just wondering of the feasibility of implementing those guidelines in the day-to-day of many organizations.
Yeah. No, it's a great question. And it's something we were really trying to strike the balance of making these guidelines both actually feasible and still aspirational. So that was really difficult to find a balance there. And I relied on my working group, many of whom are on teams within tech companies that do fairness, ethics, things like that, to try to find that balance. And it's part of why we had the structure of like the baseline practices versus the recommended practices. Like this is the bare minimum of what you should be doing, that require some resourcing, but not as much as like the recommended practices, which require quite a bit. That being said, I think an organization that would be able to really take on these guidelines, it will inevitably be like a large, well-resourced organization. Probably. I do think that often the way PAI works is trying to, I mean, when we have a policy arm, but we also focus on like trying to get adoption of practices like this in the private sector by getting massive companies, like the biggest tech companies, to adopt these practices and set it as a norm, kind of. And like, so that is an expectation in the ecosystem that that's what should be done. And then long term, I would hopefully like to see, like, I think there's all this policy coming out right now saying like algorithms have to be fair, or non-discriminatory, and there's no guidance on how to get there. And so I would like to see that level of detail in policy that requires some of the things outlined in this resource. And therefore, it wouldn't be like optional for a startup to do it or not. It's like, okay, maybe you shouldn't be building algorithmic systems if you can't guarantee that they're going to be just, to begin with. Mariska.
Hi, thank you so much for the presentation. So along the lines of what you have on the slide about making these guidelines more applicable to our own work, and I think you probably touched upon it a little bit about there's no one size fits all solution. So I was wondering if you could talk a bit about how one might go about identifying which communities to take into consideration, or like how to go about actually implementing that process?
Yeah, good question. This is something we tried to we don't go like deeply into various types of participatory research methods because that's like a whole deep field of research. We point towards various methods and like refer out to quite a few resources that are like on a spectrum of participation, from like full community control to like, consultation sort of. I think the goal is to get teams from the planning and design phase to start thinking about this, like do some like mapping of like who is being impacted by this system, who might be relevant to talk to, and then going to them to defer to of like what communities might be at risk of harm, and not assuming that like that going in, which I think is often what is done, where it's like, oh, this is probably who's being discriminated against, where it's like that shouldn't be assumption, that should come from below. Yeah.
Got it. Thank you.
Any other questions?
Okay, well, this was really great, Eliza, and I hope that we'll continue to be in touch because I'm sure that some folks from our group will want to be involved throughout the next steps. Thank you so much for talking with us today, and yeah, maybe we can have you back after the guidelines are published.
That would be great. And let me quickly share the link to our listserv if you're interested in like staying up to date with our work. I'll also, like I said, Calvin, share with you when the guidelines are published so you can share it with this group. And I would really love to hear from all of you like during our public comment process. Thank you so much for welcoming me into your session.
All right, thanks for coming, everybody, and we'll see you next time.
Bye, everyone.
All right, bye.